Good evening, everyone. Thanks for turning on the good weather for us down in Mount Gambier. However, I think the whole state's copping it, isn't it? So even in Strathalbyn, where I'm from. This is a series of presentations, and I hope a fair number of you will enjoy as much as you can. Let me tell you a little story, because I wish I could share a lot more, even about Egypt tonight and other places in the Middle East. I've walked all over the place, and there's some exciting things to share. But we can't get it all done in one night. Now, it reminds me of a little story. There was an old farmer and a young minister who was assigned to a certain location that hadn't had a minister there for years. So he finally turns up and he advertises in the town, I'm going to give my opening address on a certain day, And he turns up, and the only person that showed up was this little old farmer. So he thought, bother, something's gone wrong with the advertising. I'll call it off for a week or two. And he went down to the old farmer and he just told him, look, obviously something's gone wrong. Why don't you go home, come back next week when all the people are here. And the old farmer looked him up and down, and he said, listen here, young fella. When I go down to feed the chickens with a bucket full of feed, and only one chicken turns up for a feed, I still give him a feed. So he got the point, okay, fair enough. Maybe I'll practice my talk, that'll be good. Fair. So we got going, and he spoke for nearly 2 hours. And he went down to the back and he said to the old farmer, well, how did I do? He said, listen here, young fella. When I go down to feed the chickens with a bucket full of feed, and only one chicken turns up for a feed, I don't give him the whole bucket. So we don't want to give you the whole bucket tonight, but we'll give you some and we'll empty the bucket by the end, okay? So tonight, I want to take you down to one of the oldest civilizations on earth, the land of Egypt. It's a land of massive pyramids and mighty pharaohs, and literally a place where I saw divine predictions fulfilled. A place where kings were gods and gods were kings. Now, Egypt has been for over 150 years an archaeologist's paradise. They're always digging up stuff in Egypt. In fact, I think they probably know where things are, but they just like to bring it out bit by bit to keep the attention of the world, For after 4,000 years, its ruins and its mighty temples still stand. And its giant monuments can be seen from, more than 50 kilometres away, and its monuments, ancient monuments, have nearly defied the corroding tooth of time. Now, Egypt is fascinating for many reasons. First of all, it's the oldest continually inhabited country in the world. It has the longest line of kings of any nation on this earth. Egypt was even ancient when Christ was on the earth. Now, when you think of Egypt, what do you think of? By the way, how many have been to Egypt? Anyone? No one. Well, this is the next best thing. So we think of pyramids, right? We think of pyramids, and that may be so, but for those who have been to Egypt, and certainly me now, the memory I bring back is a lasting memory of Cairo's traffic. Because every hour is literally peak hour in Cairo. Cairo is a crowded city of nearly 22 million people, nearly the whole population of this country, that grows at a rate of nearly 500,000 every year. There are 40,000 people for every square kilometre in the greater Cairo region. And all kinds of transport, ancient and modern, jostle for position on its crowded streets. You've got the camels plodding along next to their modern counterparts. And at night, you drift off to sleep to the tune of literally millions of people beeping their horns in every car all over the city. And it's non-stop, 24/7, I tell you. You wake up at 3 o'clock in the morning, you look out over the balcony of your hotel, there's cars everywhere and they're beeping their horn. It's just peak hour all the time. I've been to Cairo a few times, and from any high point in the city, you can look out and you can see the great pyramids rising up out of the desert sands. And they discovered some 77 pyramids in Egypt. And the largest of the Egyptian pyramids is the Pyramid of Khufu of the 4th dynasty. It's located on the Giza Plateau, just on the outskirts of Cairo on the west bank of the Nile. And it's one of the 7 wonders of the ancient world. And by the way, it's the only one left. Now tomorrow we're going to go to Petra, and I'll share with you one of the new 7 wonders of the world, which is Petra. And by the way, just to give you a tip, Petra's presentation is much better than this one. I like this one. I'm not going to give you any trash, but I like Petra all the more. It's one of my favourite locations. I've been there 4 times. Now these 3 giant monoliths were built by Pharaohs Menkaure, Khafre and Khufu of the 4th dynasty of Egypt, and their more common Greek names, Mycerinus, Khephren and Cheops. Now a dynasty is simply where the throne remains in the family line and is passed down from father to son until some new family, takes over the empire, and then you have a new dynasty. And there are some 31 dynasties covering around 1800 years of antiquity, and this is according to the revised chronology of the late archaeologist David Down. Now, when it comes to Egyptian chronology, you buy a book from the bookshop about ancient Egypt, and they say something about 6,000 years ago, and this and that and so forth. You've got to understand that behind this, there's a major debate amongst archaeologists, Egyptians, archaeologists and historians, about the chronology of ancient Egypt. It's a mess, let me tell you. Many know that the dates need to be shortened, and that they have been shortened before. But, there's not a lot of agreement of how it's to be shortened and so forth. But there's a lot of very credible people who understand that the history of Egypt is far too long, and it needs to be shortened. But we're not going to get into that in this session. Now, these giant monoliths, they were built as tombs to bury their god kings, and they are the biggest gravestones you'll see anywhere on earth. The Pyramid of Khufu is 4,000 years old. It has a base, would you believe, of 13 acres. It's still one of the mightiest structures that has ever been raised by man. And it literally dominates the landscape and defies the imagination, especially when you're standing right up next to it. In its original state, it rose up 160 metres above the desert sands, and it remained the tallest building in the world for over 3,000 years. And it was only in the year 1300 that the spires of the Lincoln Cathedral exceeded it in height. The base forms a perfect square. Its sides are exactly 230 metres in length, and they are aligned exactly due north, south, east and west. It's constructed so precisely that they say no measurement is out more than 3/4 of an inch. They were brilliant in their mathematical and geometry and these sciences when they built these things. It's estimated that the pyramid consists of some 2,300,000 blocks of stone, each weighing averaging about 2.5 tonnes, and some of the inner granite stones around the tomb chamber up to 15 tonnes. And those stone blocks in the tomb chamber, they're placed so closely together, you can't get either a hair or a needle between the blocks. Now, to give you an idea how much stone was used in the 3 pyramids of Giza, now if hollow, just the Great Pyramid of Khufu could swallow up the Great Mosque of Cairo, St. Paul's Cathedral in London, the Colosseum in Rome, St. Peter's Cathedral in Rome, the Notre Dame Cathedral that was burnt down and rebuilt, and still have room to shake in a few other buildings. Now here's a good question. How were the pyramids built? And all kinds of ideas and speculation over the years. Some thought dinosaurs helped them move the blocks, or aliens came down, or some other strange things. But no, we have evidence from Egypt exactly that man built them. They were just brilliant engineers. Zawi Hawass, who's the Egyptian archaeologist, the leader archaeologist in Egypt today, he said, inside the Great Pyramid there are inscriptions telling us about the workmen who built the pyramids. Now the question is, how many workmen were required to build these pyramids? And how long did it take? I mean, the Pyramid of Khufu was a massive structure. How did they transport the huge blocks of stone across, the sand to the building site? Now, Herodotus was a Greek historian. He visited Egypt in the 5th century BC. He was asking similar questions. And he stated that it took 100,000 men 20 years to build the Great Pyramid of Khufu. And for many years, Egyptologists simply accepted the reasoning of Herodotus. They reasoned that since Pharaoh, Khufu or Cheops reigned about 22 years, therefore it would have taken nearly all that time to build his pyramid. So he had 100,000 workmen labouring for 20 years using wooden sledges to move the blocks into position. However, in relatively modern times, some significant discoveries were made by Dr. Mark Lehner. With over 30 years experience, he's retired now, he remains still one of the world's foremost Egyptologists. About 1 kilometre from the pyramids, he discovered some 4,000 workmen's huts. He also found several large bakeries capable of producing bread to feed at least 20,000 people a day. Now, there's no way you can house 100,000 workmen in 4,000 huts. So modern scholars now believe that Herodotus exaggerated the workforce and that in reality it was only 20,000 men working for 20 years to build it. Around 4,000 to 5,000 being employed full-time at the building site, and another 15,000 would have been employed part-time during the annual inundation of the Nile when they couldn't work the fields anyway, so they'd work over on the pyramid. Now the workers used, and we know this from other sites in Egypt, that they used massive supply and construction ramps built around the pyramid, the building site, to move the stones from ground level to their final position. Now, while archaeologists have known that builders used wooden sledges to move the blocks, a problem that was being debated for decades was the issue of how the builders overcame the friction in the sand. I mean, you imagine you put a heavy 2.5 tonne block of stone on that wooden sledge and tie a rope to it and drag it over the sand. The sand is going to build up and just make it impossible. So researchers at the University of Amsterdam solved the mystery 10 years ago, or so, back in 2014. Now, they discovered that with the right amount of water poured in front of the block of the sled, thus stiffening the sand, the amount of force required to move the sledge across the sand dropped by as much as 50%. Now, here's a tomb painting on the wall of a 12th dynasty provincial governor by the name of Toth-Hotep. And it shows a man pouring water in front of, moving this great statue. Now, people just thought, oh, he's making some sort of a liquid offering or something. But no, he was doing that for a very, engineering purpose of being able to move these blocks across the sand. So finally, after 1,000 years, modern man finally discovered how they move these large blocks across the desert to the building site. Now, I've done some calculating to find that if it took 20 years to lay 2,300,000 blocks of stone, the workmen would have had to lay 315 blocks of stone per day, or 26 blocks per hour per 12-hour day. Now, even using the most modern, sophisticated construction equipment we have today, it still would present a very difficult task to undertake. Now, the pyramid builders evidently were expert engineers. And when you think they're building this 3,000 years ago, without all the modern discoveries we have now, they certainly rise of some of the great builders of history. But with the brilliance of engineering and construction known only to them, they remain some of the greatest builders in human history. Now, you can see here the limestone casing on the tip of Pharaohs pyramid. This glistening white Tura limestone once encased all 3 pyramids at Giza. And so you've got an artist impression there of what it would have looked like, and all 3 of them in just glistening white limestone encasing the pyramids. All that's left now is the tip up there. Now, I went down inside the pyramid of Khafre along a narrow passageway. And, I'm a tall bloke, over 6 foot, and I was hunched down, bent over, coming down this passageway. You can see me there, huddled over, trying to carry my camera down, and, you're going a long way down, it's just not 10 feet. And then finally there's a spot where you can sort of stand up and, stretch your back out, and then you've got to go over again and go further. And after this back-breaking climb into the middle of the pyramid, you finally come into the tomb chamber. And guess what I saw? Nothing. All that work for nothing. Of course, all the pyramids and the tombs of the pharaohs had been plundered by grave robbers, centuries before, except that, of course, of Tutankhamun, which we'll look at in a minute. Now, here's another question. What about the lifestyle of the ancient Egyptians? How did people live 4,000 years ago? Well, actually, everyday life in ancient Egypt was in many respects extremely modern. Do you know the ancient Egyptians were wild about artificial wigs for both men and women, by the way. Now, here's an Egyptian lady with her mummified face painted with gold. She's wearing a wig, the hair was waved and dyed. And the dye was still in her hair. And she had it permanently waved. And the wave was still in her hair, ladies. Now, I'd call that a permanent wave if it's still there after thousands of years. Very good hairdressers back then. Egyptian women were just like some ladies today. While they loved to wear wigs, they also liked to wear body-hugging clothing. Maybe to show off, I don't know. They had stone vaporizers and atomizers for perfume. They had little nail scissors and little tweezers for plucking their hair and eyebrows. They plucked their eyebrows, they blackened them, they painted their lips. They put rouge on their cheeks, they painted their fingers and their toenails red, and they loved to wear jewellery, if they could afford it. And I visited the Pharaonic village in Cairo, and I was trying to get this girl here to smile for me. I must have taken about 10 pictures of her. Can you please smile? Grumpy, look. At last I told her, you know what? You look as beautiful as Nefertiti. That made her smile. Yes. And well it might, because Nefertiti, the wife of Pharaoh Akhenaten, was very attractive if this bust of her is at all accurate. This is the bust that's in the Egyptian Museum in Berlin. Now, Nefertiti no doubt liked sitting in front of the mirror a long time with their cosmetic box. And nothing has changed. They found these cosmetic boxes. They found lipstick and something. One tomb they found 15 different shades of lipstick for the ladies to use in the afterworld. And we think we're modern with all these things. Bless your heart, they're just coming back into fashion, aren't they? They had folding chairs, and they excelled in the arts and the crafts. Their textile industry was second to none. Even the Bible speaks of the fine linen of Egypt. They pulled a cloth out of Tutankhamun's tomb that is made of some of the finest linen known. Now, common fabric in Egypt was about 37 to 50 threads to the inch, for a peasant. Cloth from Tutankhamun's tomb was over 200 threads to the inch. Can you imagine that? No machines. They had tremendous weaving ability, but they did it. And even today, Egyptian cotton is considered some of the finest in the world. But, the Egyptian weavers, the historians have told us, could even make fabric at over 500 threads to the inch. No wonder the Bible says the fine linen of Egypt. They had surgeons, by the way, that could perform some sort of rudimentary brain operations, because they found skulls where a square of the skull has been taken out and then put back in, and it started to grow again. It's calcified and growing. Obviously the person survived then. Now, the Edwin Smith papyrus dates back to 1600 BC, and it mentions several neurosurgical procedures. Now, I visited this temple here at Komombo from the 2nd century BC, and you can even see on the walls, they've got carved there their surgical instruments. Can you see them up there? To the left of the words? Yeah. And you can also see a birthing stool showing how the ladies gave birth to their children. They had engineers who harnessed the Nile for agriculture. Egypt was known as the granary of the world, and they made, multi-grain bread. They kept beehives and probably had toast and honey on their toast. In ancient Egypt, they had umbrellas, similar to what we're using. I went and bought a Mitre 10 umbrella today. I forgot to bring one down. But not to keep the rain off in Egypt, but the sun, because it's unbearably hot and it practically never rains in Egypt. That's the reason why you could throw down your boot into the soil or the sands of Egypt, come back 200 or 300 years later and put your boot back on, because whatever goes into the sands of Egypt is just preserved forever, because it's just so crackling dry. They invented a system of writing and numerics and hieroglyphics, and they wrote all over their tombs. And that's another reason why we know so much about ancient Egypt. In fact, we know more about what happened in ancient Egypt 3,500 years ago than, say, what happened in Britain just 500 years ago. For centuries, though, travellers and treasure hunters and researchers, they went down into Egypt, but none could read the mysterious writing on the walls and on the tombs. That is, until the discovery of the famous Rosetta Stone. And I've got a little replica, at least of the face of it over there, which is a life-size replica. Now, in 1798, Napoleon Bonaparte, he invaded Egypt, and from a military point of view, his invasion was a bit of a disaster. But he took with him 120 French scholars and artists and so forth to record what they saw. And so at a small village called Rosetta, on the western delta of the Nile, his soldiers came across in the wall a stone, a black basalt stone that was trilingual, had writing on it. About 3 foot 9 inches, something like that, 2 foot 4 inches in width, about 11 inches thick. And that's when I first saw it in the British Museum, but now it has pride of place behind glass. And as soon as you walk in the British Museum, you don't take a few steps and there it is. It's one of their great artefacts, because it was this discovery that opened up the world of ancient Egypt and a lot of other history as well. About 7 million people, by the way, visit the British Museum every year. So they were one country that did a lot of archaeology in the Middle East. Now, the stone was inscribed with the same text in Greek, which was down the bottom, and in the Egyptian hieroglyphs and another Egyptian script called Demotic. And it was very largely the French scholar Champollion, who, working from the known to the unknown, and you can probably see in the hieroglyphs, there's, they have a cartouche. It's sort of in a little oval shape, and they know that's a royal name. So when they read that in the Greek, that was their first point of identification, and then they managed to work out what some hieroglyphs meant. And after, some years, 20 years of research, he was able to announce, well, we can read the hieroglyphs now. And so from 1822, they could read the hieroglyphic writing. And today, Egyptologists can read hieroglyphs as readily as we just pick up a paper or a magazine and read that. Now, when I first visited Egypt, it was back in 1995. And I asked my guide to show me where the ancient city of Memphis, the ancient Egyptian city of Memphis was. He kindly showed me on the map. And he said we'd go out and we'd have a look at the remains that day. Now, Memphis was once the proud capital of ancient Egypt, about 20 kilometres south of Cairo on the Nile. And it was the capital of Egypt in the days of, say, the biblical patriarchs, Abraham, Jacob, Joseph, Moses. It was where Egyptian history began. And Memphis was founded by Menes, the first king of the first dynasty, who united both Upper and Lower Egypt. And it was the greatest city in the world in its time and continued to be the capital of Egypt for over 500 years. It was known as the great temple city of Egypt. And I was looking forward to seeing the ruins of Memphis, because you see, down at Luxor, the capital of Egypt during the 18th and 19th dynasty, you have the greatest ancient temple ruins in the world, which is what these pictures are of the great ruins of the temple at Karnak. So I expected at Memphis, which was the capital of Egypt during the powerful early dynasties, to see more of the same. Well, my guide took me out in this open field here and said, "Mark, take your photos. Here's Memphis." I said, "Come on, I'm not paying you to be a guide for nothing. Show me something." Well, Memphis, there's hardly a trace anywhere. Now, one has to ask the obvious question, where have all the idols, the images, the remains and the temples and all that gone? Because they're just not there. Now, our guide, he took us into this small museum enclosure and said, this is all that remains of the once proud capital. Precious little to look at, Just a few broken down statues and blocks and so forth. My travel mate here is wondering just where in all the earth Memphis got up and went. Now, to give tourists something to look at, they dragged in a sphinx of Queen Hatshepsut from over 120 kilometres away because the stone statues of the gods and the god kings are gone from old Memphis. In a building nearby, you can see a colossal statue of Ramesses II of the 19th dynasty. And that's not surprising because Ramesses erected statues of himself all over the country. In fact, he erected over 500 statues of himself over Egypt, and he's known as history's most egotistical ruler. Do you know, Ramesses had 92 sons and 106 daughters. And if that doesn't make a man great, I have no idea what does. I mean, not all of the same wife, of course. He was a real stallion, evidently. Now, this is his lovely wife, Nefertari, at the temple of Abu Simbel. But notice her size next to the feet of Ramesses, revealing her comparative greatness as far as the king was concerned. But Ramesses wouldn't have felt so great if he knew what happened to his mummified body in relative recent history. You see, they wanted to ship the mummy of Ramesses off to London to go through some examinations how they might, so that they might help work out how to better preserve his mummified remains. So they took his mummy down to the docks in Cairo to ship him off to London. Well, the clerk down at the docks in Cairo he'd never shipped a mummy before, and there was no category to record the shipment of a mummy. So the closest category that he could find was dried fish. So the greatest pharaoh that ever lived was shipped off to London as dried fish. But the great Egyptian capital of Memphis today is gone. Its images of stone are gone, and the place is really hardly worth a visit. In the 7th century AD, the Arabs conquered Egypt, and the stone from old Memphis, well, what was left of it, was used to build Cairo. Whatever else was left of old Memphis is still buried under tons of Nile silt and the current village nearby. Not much has been excavated, and very little of its original palace or temples have ever been found. And you know, I couldn't help marvel at what I was seeing when I went to Memphis, because it reminded me of what one of the old Hebrew prophets had to say about Memphis during the height of its power. This is from the book of Ezekiel. It was written in the 6th century BC. I will also destroy the idols, and I'll cause the images to cease from Memphis. Now, when that prediction was written in the 6th century BC, Memphis was still the capital of Lower Egypt. However, the prediction was literally fulfilled to the very letter. As Amelia Edwards, Egyptologist, wrote in her book, 1,000 Miles Up the Nile, she said this, and this is all that remains of Memphis: elders of cities, a few rubbish heaps, a dozen or so broken statues, and a name. Where are all the stately ruins that even in the Middle Ages extended over a space estimated a half a day's journey in every direction? One can hardly believe that a great city ever flourished on this spot, or can hardly understand how it should have been effaced so utterly, and yet it was. Now, the story of the pyramids really begins here at Memphis, because it's not hard to find the necropolis or the burial complex of a city, because all you do is find the city and then head west, because they always bury their dead in the west. And west of Memphis is this place called Saqqara, and it's the first pyramid structure ever built in Egypt. It's called the Step Pyramid of King Zoser, who was the first king of the 3rd dynasty. This is a dynasty before the great 4th dynasty that built the pyramids at Cairo. Now, Zoser was fortunate enough to have a genius for his vizier, a man by the name of Imhotep. He was a remarkable architect and engineer, and he designed and he built this step pyramid that rises up in 6 stages, in 6 steps. And then he covered all over with chira, this white limestone. Now, prior to Zoser, pharaohs weren't buried in pyramids. They were buried in what they call mastabas, which were mud brick buildings erected over the burial shafts. And you can see some here at Saqqara. And what Imhotep did was build a stone mastaba, a very big one, and then on top of it erected another 5 tiers and covered it all with this white limestone. And it wasn't until the beginning of the 4th dynasty, however, that the first true pyramid was developed. So the first king of the 4th dynasty was Snefru, who seems built not 1, but 3 pyramids. So why did he build 3 pyramids? After all, a god king can only be buried in one place at one time. Well, it seems that the first pyramid that he built was at Meidum. This is about 64 kilometres south of Cairo. And what we see here is not the pyramid, but the inner core of the pyramid, because the outer casing has collapsed. And what the builders did was to build a 7-tiered stone core inside the pyramid, and then they filled in the steps with limestone casing. But archaeologists believe that this casing just collapsed, and this is probably why he said, well, I'm not going to be buried in a collapsed pyramid, so make another one. So he started again, this time at Dashur, and it's some 45 kilometres to the north of Cairo, and it's called the Bent Pyramid. I wonder why. It starts out at 54 degrees, and then it degrades to about 43 degrees about halfway up. Now, there are some cracks in this structure due to the enormous weight of stone, and perhaps this is why they changed the angle, because of the weight of the stone. And, I'm sure, look, if you were the pharaoh, I'm not going to be buried in no bent pyramid, so build another one. So they built another one, 3rd time lucky, of course, and this is called the Red Pyramid, and it's Egypt's 3rd largest pyramid, and it's Egypt's first true pyramid. Now you can climb down inside the 61-metre shaft, which is only 3 foot high, into the elaborate tomb chamber inside. So, okay, after 3 attempts, he finally got it right. Now with Snefru's son, who was Khufu or Cheops, came almost a quantum leap in pyramid building. As I mentioned earlier, the base is 13 acres. It's a perfect square, 160 metres in its original height, orientated to the 4 points of the compass. And what I find interesting, however, is a statement made by Josephus, who was a Jewish historian in the 1st century. And he said that when the biblical patriarch Abraham went down into Egypt, he communicated to the Egyptians advanced knowledge in astronomy and the mathematical sciences. This is what he said. He communicated to them arithmetic and delivered to them the science of astronomy before Abraham came to Egypt. They were unacquainted with those parts of learning. For that science came from the Chaldeans, that's in Iraq, ancient Iraq, into Egypt, and from there to the Greeks also. And that could well be the case because it was in Mesopotamia that mathematics, geometry, astronomy were first developed. We all have a watch, with 36 hours and all the rest of it, 60 minutes to the hour. All comes from Mesopotamia and their genius in mathematical sciences. In fact, the idea of building pyramids most likely came from Iraq, where they had built ziggurats that went up in steps to worship their gods that was already practiced. We're going to talk about ancient Iraq later in our series. What session is that? I don't know, number 6, I think. Anyway, that's coming up. Now, perhaps the most spectacular discovery of all time, as far as ancient Egypt was concerned, was the discovery, of course, of Tutankhamun's tomb. And the wealth of that tomb literally staggered the world when it was first discovered. Now, I travelled from Luxor across the Nile River over to the scorching Valley of the Kings. And a more inhospitable place you wouldn't find anywhere on earth, because normally it's just very, very hot most of the year out there in the desert. Well, it was down here that they made this startling discovery of Tutankhamun's tomb. And you might remember that it was Howard Carter, who was financed by a rich lord in England by the name of Carnarvon, Lord Carnarvon, who in 1922 first discovered the tomb. And Howard had uncovered other tombs and so forth. He knew Tutankhamun's tomb was there, He just didn't know where. And it was coming to the end of the season. Now, I visited there back in 2019, and when I was there, I recorded a little message for you. So listen to this. Well, we're here outside the tomb of Tutankhamun. Howard Carter tried to discover this tomb, had several seasons. He knew it was here because all the other kings of the 18th dynasty, their tombs were discovered. After several seasons, finally, Lord Carnarvon, who financed the dig, agreed to excavate for one more season. And so Howard Carter, coming back for the last and final season, came and he noticed some rubble outside the tomb of Ramesses VI. So as they cleared away the rubble, they came across a stairway, and as they excavated, they came down to a door. Well, they came into the tomb and down a long passageway, and finally to the tomb chamber door. Howard Carter chipped a small hole into the tomb chamber door, and with the light of the candle, he peered in. Lord Carnarvon was with him, and after what seemed like an eternity, Lord Carnarvon could not hold himself back any longer. He asked Howard, "What do you see? What do you see?" And what Howard said was the understatement of a century, because he said many wonderful things. As their eyes accustomed to the darkness, what they seemed to see was everything seemed to be of gold. Gold-covered boxes, gold couches, even a gold throne chair. The most amazing discovery of buried treasure that modern man has ever found. Now, as I mentioned, the first room they encountered was filled to overflowing with furniture and objects of every kind. And this is from the Pharaonic village, where they have a perfect representation of Tutankhamun's tomb as it was discovered by Howard Carter. Now there, standing guard beside the burial chamber door, were two black and gold lifestyle statues of the king. And beneath one of the couches, they found the throne chair entirely overlaid with gold. And on the back of the chair, you can see there Mr. Tutankhamun and Mrs. Tutankhamun giving her husband some good wifely attention, as all good wives do. Isn't that right, ladies? Anyway, by the way, he was only a boy king, came to the throne, they reckon, about 9, died at the age of 19, and he was not a very significant king either. Yet the wealth of his tomb literally staggered the world. Now just imagine the wealth then. Perhaps it would have been buried with Ramesses the Great, the greatest pharaoh that ever lived. Now in 2005, scientists associated with the National Geographic Society tried to determine what Tut might have looked like based on the mummified skull. And this is what they came up with. Kind of an attractive fellow, wasn't he? Well, then after 2,000 CT scans that they made of his mummified body, some years later, a new look Tutankhamun came to light, and this is what he looked like. Not exactly the handsome young man that he was first made out to be. The BBC aired a documentary called Tutankhamun: The Truth Uncovered, where they maintained that based on the CT scan data, Tutankhamun was not such a pretty boy after all. In fact, it reveals that Tutankhamun had quite an overbite in his jaw. He also had a club foot and wide hips. The so-called virtual autopsy reveals he also had Kohler disease, which is a disease of the bones. They found more than 100 walking sticks in his tomb, which were probably used by him to get around, because he had a club foot. And recent DNA analysis has revealed, by the way, that his parents were siblings, brother and sister. Now, evidently, King Tut was the product of incest and had plenty of health problems due to the genetic disorders. And he also suffered from malaria. Nonetheless, on February 1922, Howard Carter, he entered the third chamber of the tomb, bored another hole and he peered in, and he realised that what they had seen so far was a mere nothing to what they were looking at now, because the whole chamber seemed to be filled with one great big large golden shrine so huge it filled the entire room. And this is them. There's a transition going from the old Cairo Museum into the Grand Egyptian Museum now, but this is still there, all these boxes, 4 shrines, each fitting perfectly inside each other. And inside the fourth was this beautiful stone sarcophagus, which is still down in his tomb chamber today. And within this, there were 3 coffins, each fitting perfectly inside the other. Now, I hear a lot about the cost of living, and normally it's going up, right? Prices going up again and so forth. Well, I'll tell you something else that's going up, and that is the cost of dying. If you get buried in a wooden coffin, it's going to cost you a lot of money. If you get buried in a steel coffin, I tell you it's going to cost you a whole lot more. But imagine being buried in a bronze coffin. Bless your heart, I think you get such a fright, you'd sit up. But you imagine being buried in a gold coffin, shaped in the very image of the king, beautifully carved on top, inlaid with coloured glass and precious stone. Now, while each coffin was overlaid with gold, the third, in which was the mummy, was made of solid gold, weighing over 110 kilos. Imagine the worth of that. And here's Howard Carter. He's examining the 2 inner coffins and the one of solid gold. Just removing the lid was a job in itself, but when they removed it, they were looking at a man that hadn't been looked on for 2,700 years. And over his head was this beautiful death mask, made of solid beaten gold, priceless treasure of elaborate beauty and craftsmanship. Now, in the crowded Cairo Museum, there were just over 1,700 objects on display out of 5,000 objects that came out of his tomb that Howard Carter removed from the tomb of Tutankhamun. And because the Cairo Museum is so old and so crowded, the Egyptian government, for the last 20 years, mind you, I've been waiting for this to open for the last 5 years at least, but it's been about 20 years construction of the new Grand Egyptian Museum, just 1 kilometre from the pyramids. And this thing, it's had a sort of a partial opening, but it's still not fully open to the public yet. This will be the world's largest archaeological museum and the biggest museum of the world. With over 90,000 square metres of floor space, it will showcase 100,000 Egyptian artefacts. And it will showcase all of the over 5,000 objects removed from Tutankhamun's tomb. So it's still on my bucket list. When it opens, I'm saying goodbye to my wife and I'm going to Egypt for a little while. Everything was in his tomb. Feathered fans to cool the guy in the afterlife, models of servants to serve him, all around with the gods, Anubis, the jackal god of burial, the cow god Hathor. There was this gold-covered canopic shrine that held the king's mummified internal organs. The shrine was protected by the scorpion goddess Selket, who it was believed helped revive the dead and introduce the deceased into the afterlife. And inside was an alabaster shrine, and inside that, 4 golden canopic sarcophagi. So when they preserved a man, they'd take out his internal organs and they'd preserve them in these canopic jars and bury them in the shrine. This was the greatest discovery of buried treasure ever found. And they even put, golden thongs and fingers and toenail caps were made of gold as well. A vast quantity of golden treasure. And you know, when you go to Egypt and you see the staggering wealth of Egypt in its heyday, I can appreciate, perhaps, the tremendous conviction that the character Moses must have had to turn his back on all the glory and gold of that mighty empire. He could have stepped up and become the Pharaoh. In fact, it says here in the biblical record that by faith Moses, when he became of age, he refused to be called the son of Pharaoh's daughter, choosing rather to suffer affliction with the people of God than to enjoy the temporary pleasures of sin. Now let me show you something else about Egypt that's so amazing, well I find it is, so amazing and so incredible that if I hadn't seen it for myself, I'd hardly have believed this to be true. Now when you visit the Cairo Museum, you see right out in front of the old Cairo Museum this pond, and it has papyrus reeds growing in it. Now I asked my guide, why have they got these papyrus reeds growing in this pond right out the front, as you go into the Cairo Museum? Because when you go into the museums, you're just taken aback by the amount of gold. Well, he said to me, look, that's how ancient Egypt got its wealth, from those reeds. Because from the papyrus reeds, they made what? We have it in our English language today, paper. And the discovery, or the Egyptians making paper, because prior to the papyrus reed paper, all commerce and trade was done with clay tablets with a wedge-shaped cuneiform, writing on these clay tablets, which are all over the place as well. But when the papyrus, that was like the discovery of the internet. It was just so tremendous for commerce and so on. It made the Egyptians fabulously wealthy around the Mediterranean world. And they were the first to make it. And so they placed it right out front to let tourists and visitors to Egypt see where the ancient wealth came from. They skinned these reeds, they soaked them, laid them out flat, and then crisscrossed them together and put them under heavy weight and so on, and dried it out. And it's the best paper, and it's still there after 3,000 years. Now, the interesting thing is that there were millions of these papyrus reeds growing in the Nile Delta, all over the place, in the waterways and so on. However, you can go over and buy a ticket and go to Egypt today and go from one end of the Nile today, and you won't find a single blade of papyrus growing naturally anywhere. Now, for the tourists, there's one farm, and they've got some papyrus, but it doesn't just naturally grow, it dies out. They've got to keep on importing it from further up the Nile and Uganda and other places in order to have some papyrus to give tourists to take home, because the ancient papyrus reed that was so prolific is gone from ancient Egypt today. Now, this is Dr. Rajab's Pharaonic village in Cairo that shows tourists what life was like on the River Nile in ancient times. And they had their boats made out of papyrus because there was precious little wood in ancient Egypt. And outside the Pharaonic village, they had this boat, which is a replica, and you might remember this character, I don't know, Thor Heyerdahl. Does anyone remember his expeditions, the Ra expeditions? Yeah. He sailed a papyrus boat across the Atlantic. His thesis was he wanted to prove that the ancient Egyptians got their culture from the ancient Americas, because there's vastly more pyramids in South America than there is in Egypt. And I've been over there too. And he might have been correct in his thesis. So while he built the boat in Egypt, he couldn't get any papyrus from Egypt because there's none there. So he had to get 500 bales of papyrus shipped in from Ethiopia, further up the Nile, because papyrus has become extinct in Egypt. Now, this reminds me of what another statement of one of these Hebrew prophets made in the heyday of Egyptian power back in the 8th century before Christ. The prophet said, "The papyrus reeds by the river, by the mouth of the river, and everything sown by the river, shall wither, be driven away, and be no more." Now, look, that would be as ridiculous and stupid if I was to say all the rice will die out and be no more in Asia. Or all the wheat will be no more in Australia. Because it was the number one commodity in ancient Egypt. The bulrushes by the Nile and so forth like that. And Isaiah 19, it contains both a predicted judgment and a blessing upon Egypt. And while some translations don't use the term papyrus reeds, what is sure is that there is a predicted judgment against the Nile and the cultivated crops grown beside it. And the number one cultivated crop, or the one great natural resource, was the papyrus along the Nile waterways. The ancient Egyptians traded their paper for gold and other commodities all around the ancient world. The Washington Post even had an article, "When Papyrus Ruled," but it doesn't rule in Egypt anymore. And the article said, exports of Egyptian-made papyrus paper beginning about 3000 BC raised money needed to maintain the armies on the Nile. In later millennia, papyrus exports from government-controlled marshes would become the chief source of income for Egyptian monarchs. Now notice what Thor Heyerdahl had to say concerning the papyrus reed in his book, The Ra Expeditions. He said, Pharaoh lies in his tomb with reed boats painted on the stone walls, stone and reeds, stone in the desert and reeds on the shores of the Nile. Stone and papyrus reeds were nature's gift to the people of the Nile. Stone was transported on papyrus, and papyrus boat was immortalised in stone. The papyrus flower appears again and again in the art of ancient Egypt. It was the national symbol of Upper Egypt, but that was a long time ago. No papyrus grows in Egypt now. Plenty of stone if you want to build a pyramid, but not enough papyrus for a toy dinghy. Then he says, papyrus had died out in Egypt and no one knew why. The gods had taken back one of the oldest gifts, as if they had simply pulled it up by the roots. And you know, I can tell you, you can travel the Nile from one end to the other in Egypt today, and the papyrus reed, which grew so prolifically as ancient Egypt's greatest natural resource, is extinct today, except where they cultivate it for tourism. Yet further up the Nile, this is in Uganda, papyrus reeds grow naturally in great abundance, all around. Now, in the small waterways of the Pharaonic village, you can see a lot of papyrus growing there to show tourists what it was like all over the Nile. And I asked my guide if the papyrus grew naturally here. He said, no, it lasts for a few years and then it dies out and they have to continually replant. Now, as researcher Victor Henn wrote in his book on plants in the ancient world, he said, it's very remarkable that the papyrus is now quite extinct in Egypt. Well, it is remarkable. But what I find even more remarkable is some prophet back in the 8th century BC could predict it. And you don't even have to be a believer to accept what I'm saying here, because the fact is the fact. The prophet said the papyrus would be no more. And that's exactly how history has unfolded. And you don't have to have any faith at all to accept that, because the fact is the fact. Now let me just share with you one or two more amazing prophecies concerning Egypt. When the Hebrew prophets like Isaiah and Ezekiel lived, Egypt was then so ancient, she had boasted a longer line of kings than any other nation. To Ezekiel, the settling of Egypt was as ancient as the beginning of the Christian religion is to us. To the prophets of his day, back in 600 BC, they knew Egypt as the granary of the world, eminent in science and arts, luxury, magnificence, leader of civilization and knowledge. She had the unity and the repose, the calm majesty of conscious power and the grandeur of great age. Her future looked bright and prosperous. Nevertheless, at a time when other men would have predicted for her practically unending prosperity, Ezekiel wrote down the words from his God. I will sell the land of Egypt into the hand of the wicked. I'll make the land waste, and all that is therein by the hand of strangers. I, the Lord, have spoken it. And there shall be no more a prince of the land of Egypt. That's a big, bold statement, because if you have no princes anymore of the land of Egypt, that means you have no what? No kings, no pharaohs, no natural Egyptian pharaohs or kings of Egypt. No more a prince. Now, this was in the 6th century BC. Now, although Egypt has boasted the longest line of kings of any nation on this earth, for the last 2,300 years, every last king that has sat on the throne of Egypt has been a foreigner. Every one of them. When Pharaoh Psammek III died after battling the Persians in the Battle of Pelusium in 525 BC, George Rawlinson wrote, thus perished the last of the long line of pharaohs which, commencing with Menes, had ruled Egypt as a great independent monarchy for not less than 20 centuries. Egyptians came back in dynasties 28 to 30, which only lasted for about 40 years. The last Egyptian king was Nectanebo II of dynasty 30. Dynasty 31 was not an Egyptian dynasty, it was a Persian dynasty. Then came the Greek period, beginning with Alexander the Great, and then on we go to the Romans and so forth. For example, Cleopatra was down in Egypt, remember that? But she wasn't Egyptian. She was a descendant of one of the generals of Alexander's army and so on. So, from the Persian king, 343 BC, to the last king of Egypt, which was King Pharaoh, who was deposed in 1952, every single ruler of Egypt has been a foreigner. And again, you don't have to be a believer, because the fact is the fact. It wasn't long after Ezekiel wrote that, there will be no more a prince of the land of Egypt, and that has just proved true. Now, Ezekiel continues his prediction concerning Egypt, and he says this: they shall be a lowly kingdom. It'll be the lowliest of kingdoms. It shall never again exalt itself above the nations. I will diminish them so that they will not rule over the nations anymore. So Egypt would go into decline. And you know as well as I do, while Egypt is famous for tourism, everyone goes to Egypt to see the glory of the ancient past of Egypt. Isn't that right? Yeah. No modern glory. The people are impoverished. Beautiful people, by the way. But people don't go to Egypt for any greatness today. They go to see the greatness of the past. 49, or nearly 50% of Egypt's 90 million people live in poverty, with over 26% in extreme poverty. 31% of children under 5 are stunted due to malnutrition. 50% of people in Egypt, can you imagine? They live on $2 US a day or less. But they're beautiful people. This is in the local markets. Here's some ladies using their heads. How they do it, I don't know. Here's a local baker. But I don't think I want that loaf there. Or the one behind it. Here's a local butcher delivering meat. You go to the markets, you know. I took a photo of some fellow, I think it might have been up there. They have the meat hanging out in the open. Every now and again he whacks it with a stick and all the little flies come off. Donkeys are the four-wheel drives of Egypt. They carry or tow absolutely anything. One of them got a great big water pump on its back there. Look at that. The kids, you know, they get a rest now and again, the donkeys, and the kids play with them. But they live, you know, they're delightful. They love tourists. They smile at you and come up and talk to you. But they live in poverty. The prophet said, the pride of her power will come down. I'll make the land of Egypt desolate, and the country shall be destitute of that whereof it was full. And again, I say to you, you don't have to be a believer to accept this, because again, a fact is a fact. That's just the truth of the matter when it comes to the history of Egypt. And the sun may have set on Egypt's past glory, but the glory of that old book of books still shines in all of its brilliance in our modern age. Amazing predictions of biblical prophets have stood the test of time, and their words seem to have come true in every detail. The evidence of archaeology over the last 150 years, right across the Bible lands of the Middle East, has demonstrated time and time again that the history and even the predictions of that old book of books are indeed trustworthy and reliable. Now, Nelson Glueck was an American, born of German Jewish parents. He became an expert archaeologist and an expert on ancient pottery and dating time periods based on the pottery discovered in the various layers. He identified over 1,500 sites during his career. Listen to what this eminent archaeologist wrote in his book. No archaeological discovery has ever controverted a biblical reference. That is a very big and bold statement to make. But he made it, and it hasn't proved false since he made it. He went on to say, scores of archaeological findings have been made which confirm in clear outline or in exact detail the historical statements in the Bible. Now, not too many people throw bouquets at the Bible today. But I'm very interested in what these eminent people have to say about it. Sometimes people ask me, Mark, what do you think is the greatest contribution of biblical archaeology? When we talk about biblical archaeology, we're talking about archaeology in the Middle East, because this is the Bible lands where the Bible was written, born. Well, I think biblical archaeology has two very major contributions that stand out. Firstly, Archaeology helps us to restore history from the ancient past, like the discovery of the Rosetta Stone and so on. It helps reconstruct the past. And secondly, and it doesn't set out to prove this, but this is the outcome of it, archaeology has helped to restore the credibility of the biblical story and of its history. For over 30 years now, that book has just captivated my attention. And its history continues to be verified by archaeological excavation. I find it actually to be an amazing book. Its ancient mysteries are wonderfully simple, and they're simply wonderful. And I trust that you would continue to join me on this digging up the past adventure or journey, because tomorrow afternoon we have a very special double program to share with you. Tomorrow afternoon at 3:30 p.m. we're going to travel to Jordan. I've been there 4 times, and we're going to visit the famous ancient city of Petra, a city that was lost to the Western world for over 1,000 years. An ancient city carved in stone that attracts hundreds of thousands, if not more than 1 million, of tourists every year. And today it's Jordan's #1 tourist attraction. And I've been there 4 times, but I'm happy to go again. And you'll be impressed by what we show there in Petra. And then we'll have a break. In our second session tomorrow afternoon, we're going to have an absolutely thrilling program. Now, go and have a look at the display here. I think I'm going to have to pack it down after our meeting on Sunday. But I'm going to share with you what I consider to be the top 7 discoveries of biblical archaeology. And there are thousands, but I'm just going to try to pick some of the major ones that really had headline news around the world. And we'll share that tomorrow afternoon and tell you the story of their discovery. And then on Sunday afternoon at 3:30, we're going to deal with perhaps the most famous manuscript discovery of all time, that is the Dead Sea Scrolls. And we will find what those scrolls have to do with one of the greatest kings of antiquity, the Persian king Cyrus the Great, who established the Persian Empire. This is going to be a thrilling program. We'll travel to Iran and so forth. That's what we're going to do there on Sunday. And then on Wednesday evening, the week to come, we're going to join Alexander the Great in his famous siege of the seaport city of Tyre on the Lebanon coast, and see how that famous event fulfilled an absolutely astounding biblical prediction. So that's what we've got coming over the weekend and just into next week. And so, ladies and gentlemen, from the people of Egypt and from me, thank you for being a great audience, and I trust you've enjoyed our program tonight and look forward to seeing you tomorrow afternoon.